Now we'll talk about Azure multi-factor authentication. To begin, what is multi-factor authentication? Well, multi-factor authentication is a method of authentication that refers to having 2 out of 3 possible things. Now, those 2 of 3 things are something you know, something you have, and something you are. The most common implementations being something you know is typically a password, although in some cases could be a PIN. Something you have would be a device, a smartphone or a smart card, or maybe a key device, but some physical device that you have in your possession. And then finally, something you are refers to biometrics. And biometrics can come in many forms: facial recognition, thumbprints, any number of methods of identifying based on physical characteristics. Windows Hello that uses face recognition is an example of using biometrics, and so are the many thumbprint scanners that are available. Now, Azure MFA requires that you provide a second method in addition to your password, and what it supports are a couple of things. A phone call. A phone call is a form of something you have, in the sense that it will call your phone, or a text message. There's also mobile app notifications. So again, these come down to the most common forms being integrating your mobile device in some way, shape, or form to be that second factor of authentication. And with Azure multi-factor authentication, that's the simplest and easiest way to do this. Now, there's a couple of variations of Azure multi-factor authentication. The first one is called Azure MFA for administrators. Now, this is available to any instance of Azure Active Directory. It doesn't require Azure AD Premium, and you can essentially turn on multi-factor for any of your administrator accounts, any account that's a global admin on your subscription, to protect that privileged account. You then have a couple of other options with Azure AD Premium that allow you to extend multi-factor authentication to any user in your organization. Finally, you have this notion of what's called MFA for on-premises. Now, this is the scenario where you want to use multi-factor authentication for resources that are in your own data center, and you want to leverage the Azure multi-factor authentication infrastructure for that. So there's a server you can install on site that will integrate with Azure and leverage Azure's multi-factor mechanisms for things like PINs or SMS or phone call or whatever method that you choose. And this is valid for typically for VPN scenarios, remote desktop gateway server scenarios, and anything that can make use of a radius server, which is just a standard way of relaying authentication requests. And so the most common scenarios where you'll find multi-factor authentication: for the Azure portal for administrators, for Office 365 for regular users that want to get access to email, to SharePoint, to files, any resources that are in Office 365, and then for on-premises for remote desktop gateway and VPN devices. Also, you can use this with federated users for ADFS, so that you can have multi-factor authentication on an application you've created and federated with Azure Active Directory. I want to take a few minutes and talk about the Azure MFA server. So this is a separate software installation that you will install on a Windows Server computer in your data center, and it's typically used to provide multi-factor authentication for VPN or RDP scenarios. Now, when you install the multi-factor authentication server, you configure it to use your instance of Azure Active Directory. Now, when you go to authenticate against either a VPN or RDP, it will forward the authentication request to Azure. Azure will see that MFA is required, complete the authentication process using MFA, and reply back that that part of the authentication has now been satisfied. So then, in combination with your username password, gives you two-factor and allows you to log on. So it's a simple way of extending on-premises and just kind of putting additional security on on-premises authentication to incorporate multi-factor. So one of the easiest and simplest ways that you can do it. So here are some examples of where you might choose multi-factor within Azure natively or the multi-factor authentication server. So for Microsoft applications, you can use either. For SaaS applications that are in the App Gallery, you can use either the multi-factor server or Azure native multi-factor. For anything published through the application proxy, where you need the multi-factor server are apps that are native in your data center, so they're not using an app proxy, or they provide internal access like VPN or remote desktop services gateway. So depending on the location of the user, if it's an Azure AD user, you can use Azure multi-factor authentication. If you have Azure AD and on-premises with federation, you would need both. If you have Azure AD without password synchronization, so the passwords are potentially different, you would need both. If you have Azure AD with password synchronization, you can leverage only Azure multi-factor. You don't need the Azure MFA server. And then if all you have is local Active Directory, you can use the Azure multi-factor authentication server. Keep in mind that you don't necessarily need to be a user of Azure AD to take advantage of this. If all you have is on-premises data center, you can simply use Azure to extend that to give you that multi-factor capability. Once you've configured multi-factor authentication, there's a few options that you can view, and here's some examples of some of these options. You have, for example, something called one-time bypass, which allows a user to bypass multi-factor maybe for the purpose of troubleshooting. You have options for trusted IPs, locations where multi-factor is not required, and you also have the option for remembering it for certain devices, so that if you're on a particular device, maybe a particular tablet or phone or computer, then once you've authenticated once, they can remember that setting so you don't have to use multi-factor every single time. And then finally, the notion of conditional access, which means you can require multi-factor if you're a member of a particular group. For example, it's not set on your user account, but if you're in the administrators group or the HR group or maybe the finance group, by virtue of being a member of that group, you're required to use multi-factor authentication. Enabling multi-factor is very straightforward. You simply go to the user properties in Azure Active Directory, and there's an option for multi-factor authentication, and from there you can select the users that you want to modify and enable multi-factor authentication. When they log on for the first time after multi-factor authentication has been enabled, they'll be prompted to configure their multi-factor settings. For example, when you enable it, if you say you must use a mobile device, they'll then be prompted to configure their mobile device for multi-factor. If they don't complete those steps, they won't be allowed to log on, and they can't log on until they've fully validated that their mobile device is compliant. You can do this in the UI, or you can also do bulk modification using PowerShell.